I never expected a throwaway joke to change my entire life. It was just a casual comment, tossed into the air like a balloon at the end of a long, exhausting day. I said it with a laugh, not expecting an answer. Not expecting the way she'd look at me, quiet, steady, holding something I didn't yet understand. "Marry me when you're ready," I joked. And then she said it. Whispered it, like she wasn't sure if she should. "I'm 49. Is that ready enough?" That moment split my world wide open. It was one of those lines that lingers in the air long after it's spoken. One of those things that sounds simple until you realize it's not simple at all. Because love never is. Especially when it sneaks up on you slowly, then all at once. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Her name was Claire, and I met her during what I thought was a low point in my life. I'd recently left a job that had drained me for years. I was burned out of shape, and emotionally raw from a string of relationships that had fizzled out before they ever had a chance to mean something. I had moved back to my hometown to regroup, crashing in my childhood bedroom while I figured out what came next. It wasn't supposed to be permanent. Just a pause. A breath. Something simple. But life had other plans. I met Claire when I took on a short-term maintenance gig at a community arts center, an old building that needed love, like everything else in that town. I was supposed to paint walls, fix light fixtures, maybe power wash the back patio. Nothing complicated. Nothing that required too much thought. But on my second day, I found her struggling with a ladder in one of the back rooms. She was trying to hang string lights, standing on her tiptoes and cursing under her breath when the stool she was balancing on began to wobble. I reached out instinctively, steadying her before the whole thing tipped. She laughed, breathless, and muttered something about refusing to let her age keep her from doing things herself. I didn't know her name then. I didn't know her story. But I knew the way she looked at me, like she was seeing me, not just looking through me. That stuck with me longer than I wanted to admit. She wasn't what you'd call traditionally beautiful, not in the way magazine covers pretend women should be, but there was something about her that made you stop. The kind of beauty that came from experience, from quiet confidence, from years of choosing to show up even when life didn't make it easy. She had these gray-blue eyes that caught light, like glass, and when she smiled, it was always crooked, just slightly uneven, like she knew something the rest of us didn't. She wore jeans that hugged her hips, paint-flecked boots, and a faded flannel shirt like it was armor. Her hair was streaked with silver, pulled back in a loose braid that fell over her shoulder. There was power in the way she carried herself, subtle but unshakable, like she'd survived things that could have broken her and decided instead to wear them like medals. I noticed all of it in the first 5 minutes. Over the next few days, I kept finding reasons to pass through the rooms she was in. She wasn't a regular at the center, more like a part-time volunteer and part-time miracle worker. She ran a local women's shelter, did freelance mural work, and still found time to teach kids how to draw on Saturdays. Everyone in the building knew her, respected her. She had that way about her. Like if you stood too close for too long, you'd end up wanting to be better just because she existed. We talked in little fragments at first, snippets between tasks. She teased me about my messy paint lines. I asked why she always smelled like coffee and lemon. Then one day she brought me a thermos of black coffee and said, "Because you look like the kind of man who never makes time to eat breakfast." She wasn't wrong. She told me later she didn't expect to like me. That men 10 years younger than her had always either tried too hard or not at all. But I didn't know how to try, and maybe that was part of the magic. I wasn't looking for anyone. I wasn't putting on a show. I was just tired. And maybe that's why we found each other. Because tired people recognize other tired people. And sometimes, in the space between exhaustion and healing, something delicate begins to grow. Something honest. The moment I knew I was in trouble wasn't dramatic. It wasn't some sweeping romantic gesture or a kiss under the stars. It was the day she fixed the lock on a broken window using nothing but a butter knife and a screwdriver, then looked over her shoulder and said, You'd be amazed how many things in life can be fixed if you just stop overcomplicating them. And I realized I wanted to hear her say things like that every day. I wanted to learn what else she knew. I wanted to stay close to whatever warmth she carried around like a secret. We didn't go on dates. Not at first. We cleaned supply closets, together, painted walls, retiled a bathroom floor that had needed help since 2002. But every day felt like something more. Like the quiet beginning of a sentence I wasn't ready to finish. Then, one evening, after the last coat of paint had dried and the sun was starting to drop behind the hills, we sat on the back steps of the building, sharing a bag of trail mix and passing a lukewarm soda back and forth. She was talking about how time speeds up when you stop paying attention. I smiled and said, "Well, when you're ready, just marry me." It was meant to be funny, light, safe. But she didn't laugh. She just looked at me, then whispered, "I'm 49. Is that ready enough?" And I swear, in that moment, everything shifted. The air between us after she said those words felt different, like we'd crossed into some new territory without a map, no way back, and neither of us sure what to say next. I didn't respond right away. Not because I didn't want to, but because the question hit deeper than I'd expected. I saw something behind her eyes that night, something raw and unguarded, something that said she hadn't meant it as a joke, even if I had. And that was the thing. I'd spent so many years drifting, passing through relationships, friendships, jobs, and cities, like someone who couldn't stay long enough to leave a mark. And yet here I was, with a woman who said 6 words that made the rest of the world disappear. "I'm 49. Is that ready enough?" What does a man say to that when he's not even sure where the ground is anymore? But I didn't run. I didn't change the subject or laugh it off. I just looked at her, really looked, and nodded once. That was it. Nothing fancy, no grand speech, just a simple gesture that meant more than I could explain. She nodded too, not smiling, but not sad either. Like maybe she'd been waiting for someone who wouldn't flinch. After that night, something subtle shifted between us. We didn't talk about it again for a while, but it hung in the air, a silent agreement neither of us had to repeat. I started finding more excuses to stay late at the center, not just to fix things, but to linger, to be in her orbit a little longer each day. We started cooking together in the break room kitchen, a few nights a week, then most nights, then nearly every night. She'd bring over mismatched Tupperware containers with half-prepped ingredients, and I'd contribute whatever I could afford. That week from the grocery store, it wasn't fancy food, pasta, rice, the occasional grilled cheese if we were tired. But there was a rhythm to it, a quiet ritual that made it feel like home. She liked to chop vegetables with military precision, while I leaned against the counter, asking her about her day, just to hear her voice. There was something about the way she told stories. Never dramatic, never self-pitying, but filled with little details that made them come alive. Like the teenager who dropped out of school but painted murals on the back walls of abandoned buildings. Or the single mom who taught herself to build furniture out of salvaged wood because her kid needed a bed. Claire saw people, really saw them, and she remembered their stories like they mattered. That was something I admired more than I could say. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. One night, a storm rolled in just as we finished eating. The lights flickered, and she lit a candle without missing a beat. We sat there in the glow, sipping tea, listening to the wind rattle the windows, and I asked her what she wanted out of life. Not the usual surface stuff, but the real question, the one people don't ask unless they're ready to hear something heavy. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I want someone who stays when the power goes out. That's it." And I knew what she meant. She wasn't talking about literal storms. She was talking about all the times life had fallen apart, and people had walked away. Lovers, friends, even family. They always seemed to vanish when things got hard, and all she wanted now was someone who didn't. I looked at her across that flickering table and said, "I'm still here." It wasn't a promise. It wasn't a vow, but she smiled, and that was enough. As the weeks passed, We fell into a pattern that felt more and more like a life being built. I helped her fix up her garage, turning it into a little studio space where she could paint without interruption. She came with me to visit my sister in the next town over, bringing homemade bread wrapped in a tea towel and winning over my niece with crayons and stories about when she used to teach art classes. We never made a big announcement, never had a DTR talk, never slapped labels on what we were. But everyone around us seemed to know anyway. The volunteers at the center started calling me Claire's guy, and my friends stopped asking if I was seeing anyone else. It just became understood. We were something steady, something real. Still, there were moments when I could feel her holding back. Not because she didn't trust me, but because she'd learned to keep her hopes in check. She'd been through enough to know that nothing lasts forever, that people get scared, that good things can turn sour with little warning. And I understood that fear. I carried my own version of it, but every time I saw her hesitate, when she pulled away a little too fast after a kiss, or changed the subject when the future came up, I made a choice to stay grounded, to not push, to not demand more than she could give in that moment. Because I believe that love grows best when you give it room, not when you rush it. And slowly, day by day, she started to open up more. She let me see the sketches she never showed anyone else. She told me about her mother, who died young, and how that loss had shaped her in ways she was still untangling. She even invited me to a reunion dinner with some old college friends, where she introduced me as her favorite accidental miracle, and we both laughed until our ribs ached. There were no fireworks, no declarations written in the sky, just a steady unfolding of something beautiful and rare. A kind of intimacy built not on intensity, but on consistency. On the way, she always saved me the last slice of pie. On the way, I always made sure her car had gas before a long trip. On shared silence. On showing up. That, to me, was love. Not the kind that burns bright and dies fast, but the kind that holds your hand through the mundane and makes it magic. The kind that turns throwaway jokes into lifelong turning points. The days that followed felt more like chapters than calendar pages, each one holding its own quiet revelation, its own rhythm. I wasn't keeping score, but if I had, I'd say, it was around that third month that everything began to deepen in a way I hadn't expected. It wasn't about grand gestures or sudden declarations. It was about presence. Real, daily presence. Claire and I developed a rhythm that felt so natural, so unforced, that I sometimes forgot we hadn't known each other our entire lives. We'd fall into conversations the way most people fall into routines, and somehow those conversations turned into our own kind of intimacy. We never spoke in love language cliches or long-winded speeches. It was in the way she'd start a sentence and I'd finish it, or how she'd leave a note beside my thermos when I'd head out to work. Simple things like, "Today will be good," or "Don't forget the extra bolts." I started to anticipate her moods, and she started trusting me with her silences. There was one particular afternoon that stands out. The community center had just wrapped up an art therapy workshop for veterans, and Claire was organizing the pieces for a gallery-style event she wanted to host in the fall. I was there to hang frames and drill wall mounts, but more than that, I was there because I wanted to be part of the world she was building. As she floated between canvases, offering encouragement and rearranging lighting, I watched her with a quiet admiration. She wasn't the kind of woman who needed to be the center of attention. Instead, she had this way of making other people feel seen. That was her gift. She didn't try to fix people, she simply made space for them to grow. And that kind of kindness, genuine, patient, steadfast, was something I hadn't realized I was craving until I found it in her. After the last of the paintings were hung, we sat on the floor with takeout containers and paper cups of cheap red wine, staring at the final product of our teamwork. She leaned her head on my shoulder and sighed, and I remember thinking, I could do this forever. Not just the gallery or the center, but the way she made the everyday feel like a quiet victory. That night, as we cleaned up and locked the doors, she turned to me and said, "You make things easier just by being around." And I knew she didn't mean it as flattery. It was her way of telling me she felt safe. That mattered more than any romantic declaration ever could. Around that time, my best friend Nate noticed the change in me. "You've got that look," he said, squinting over his coffee one morning. like a guy who stopped searching. I didn't deny it. How could I? Claire had become the unexpected center of my world, and I found myself rearranging plans, priorities, even dreams to fit her into them. And not because she asked me to, because I wanted to. I started seeing my life in terms of we instead of me, and that wasn't something I had ever expected to want. When I told Nate that I wasn't sure what this meant long-term, that Claire had been hurt before and might not be quick to remarry, or even want to, he just grinned and said, "Then build something new. Doesn't have to look like anyone else's idea of love." That sentiment stuck with me. Claire wasn't the type to fit into someone else's mold, and I didn't want to ask her to. She had earned every line on her face, every scar on her heart, and I wasn't there to rewrite her past. I was there to co-author the future, whatever shape it took. One morning, while we were fixing a leaky faucet in her kitchen, she said, "You ever think about leaving town?" It came out of nowhere. Casual, like she was talking about changing shampoo brands. But I caught the undertone. She was wondering if I could be happy here, if I was only sticking around because of her. I told her the truth. I've lived in more places than I can count, but this is the first one that feels like home. She didn't say anything back, just nodded and handed me the wrench, but I saw the way her shoulders softened, like a weight had lifted. From then on, we started, dreaming together, softly, cautiously. She mentioned wanting to start a side project mentoring young artists. I talked about fixing up an old delivery van and turning it into a mobile repair shop that could help folks who couldn't afford traditional services. We weren't planning a wedding or picking baby names. We were building a blueprint for a life rooted in mutual support and respect, and for us, that was enough. We spent weekends driving out to local flea markets and thrift stores, looking for quirky furniture or old tools I could refurbish. One Sunday, we found a beat-up wooden sign that read, "This is it." She bought it without hesitation and hung it in her studio. "In case we ever forget," she said with a smile. Life didn't suddenly become perfect. We had disagreements about money, schedules, and occasionally about how much room we needed to be ourselves within the relationship. But those moments never became wars. They were discussions, sometimes heated, but always rooted in the desire to understand rather than win. That was something I'd never had before. Someone who didn't need to be right, only real. Claire had a way of calming storms before they started, and I made it a point to never walk out of a room until we'd found common ground again. One evening, while walking her dog through the neighborhood, she asked me, "Do you ever regret saying that? That joke you made about marrying me?" I paused, not because I needed to think, but because I wanted to be sure I said it exactly right. "Not even for a second," I replied. "Best joke I ever told." She laughed. Really laughed. The kind that comes from deep in the chest, and, for a moment, the years between us, the doubts, the what-ifs, they all faded into the background. In their place stood two people who had found each other not through force or fantasy, but through patience and truth. By then, we had become more than just a couple. We were a team, a unit, a pair of individuals who still honored their own space, but found comfort in returning to each other. There were still many unknowns ahead of us, and neither of us pretended to have it all figured out. But for the first time in a long while, I believed that the future, whatever it looked like, was something worth leaning into. There was something about the way fall settled into our small town that made everything feel more intimate. The leaves turned from green to burnt orange and gold, the air became crisp and hinted at wood smoke, and everyone slowed down just enough to notice each other a little more. Claire loved that time of year. She said it reminded her that change could be beautiful, that things didn't have to be permanent to be meaningful. She threw herself into organizing a seasonal fundraiser at the community center, one of her many quiet passions. I found myself pulled into her orbit more and more, not just as a willing assistant, but as someone who genuinely wanted to help her vision come to life. We were building something beyond just a relationship. We were becoming fixtures in each other's worlds. The fundraiser was a harvest-themed art show and silent auction. Claire had a gift for these things, curating, coordinating, convincing sponsors to donate without ever sounding like she was begging. I watched her in awe most days, quietly hammering, frames into place or hauling supplies, amazed at how naturally she led with both strength and softness. Our dynamic remained steady and comfortable. We had our rituals, early coffee on her back porch, grocery runs where she insisted on reading every ingredient label, evenings spent cooking new recipes that usually ended with flour on her nose or a sauce stain on my shirt. These were not the loud, cinematic moments people wrote songs about, but they were ours. And they were honest. But as things often go when everything feels too perfect, life began testing us in the small, inconvenient ways it tends to do. My father, who had been out of the picture for most of my life, suddenly reappeared with a diagnosis: liver failure. I hadn't spoken to him in years, and now he was asking for forgiveness, asking for help, asking if I'd sit with him during treatments. The resentment in me flared like dry kindling, all those years of absence and silence rushing back. But Claire didn't tell me what to do. She just listened. She made space. And when I finally broke down one night on her couch, angry and confused and unsure if I owed this man anything at all, she simply put her hand on my chest and said, "Whatever you decide, make sure it's for your peace, not anyone else's." That kind of understanding? It's rare. It doesn't scream for attention. It doesn't need to be praised. It just wraps around you quietly, making you feel steady when the ground underneath you begins to shift. I did end up visiting my father. Not often, and not out of obligation, but because something inside me needed to understand where I came from before I could fully choose where I was going. Claire never pushed, but she always checked in. Sometimes that was all I needed, someone who remembered to ask. During this time, something else began to change, subtly, then more boldly. People began to assume Claire and I were a package deal. Her colleagues would refer to me as her guy or her person. My buddies started inviting her to weekend barbecues before they even asked if I was free. We never talked about labels or future plans, but we also never avoided the reality of what we were becoming. One night, after a quiet dinner at my place, Claire looked around my apartment, eyes landing on the stack of books she'd left on my nightstand, the extra sweater hanging over the chair, the half-empty bottle of her favorite lotion by the sink. "Do you realize I've slowly moved into your life without either of us noticing?" she said, half joking. I smiled and answered, "Best invasion I've ever experienced." We still had moments of doubt. Age wasn't a constant topic, but every once in a while it would creep in through the cracks, especially when her friends or family made offhand comments. Claire had a niece around my age who once asked if I was her latest midlife crisis. It was meant to be a joke, but it hung in the air like smoke from a fire no one wanted to acknowledge. I never responded. I didn't need to. Claire's sharp glance in her niece's direction was answer enough. But later, when we were alone, she asked if I ever worried about the future, about being with someone whose age might one day become more noticeable, more complicated. I told her the truth. We all age. The only thing I worry about is not having enough time with you. That seemed to land somewhere deep in her heart. She didn't cry, but she kissed me like I'd just handed her a lifeline. The fundraiser came and went with massive success. Claire was radiant that night, dressed in a deep burgundy gown that brought out the gold in her eyes, surrounded by artists and volunteers who clearly admired her. I stood by her side, proud and content, shaking hands and answering questions, as if I'd always been a part of that world. When the night wound down and we were finally alone, she sat on the hood of my truck, barefoot and sipping champagne from a plastic cup. "I think," she said slowly, "this is the happiest I've ever been." I didn't say anything. I just leaned in and kissed her gently, like a promise. We never needed a ceremony to validate what we had. No rings, no legal contracts. But that night felt like a vow, an unspoken commitment to continue choosing each other. Not because we had to, not because anyone expected us to, but because we genuinely wanted to. That kind of connection doesn't happen every day. And when it does, you hold on to it with both hands. Fall turned to winter, and with it came the quiet that only cold can bring. Snow muffling the noise of the world, blanketing even the busiest corners of the town in stillness. The season, with its bare trees and early sunsets, made everything feel slower, more introspective. It was in that quiet, as I spent more time tucked into the rhythm of Claire's life, that I realized something had shifted. Our bond wasn't just built on chemistry or shared time anymore. It was built on resilience. There was a steadiness between us now, something unspoken but constantly felt. We were starting to inhabit each other's lives like two old, well-fitted gloves, worn in the best way, comforting, dependable. She had her routines, her coffee mugs lined up by the kitchen window, her Sunday crossword puzzles, her penchant for old jazz records that played softly in the background as she cooked. I found myself falling in love with these little pieces of her, just as much as with her laugh, her voice, or the way she touched the side of my face when I got too lost in my own thoughts. Work was slow during the winter, as it always was. Fewer people thought about deck repairs or outdoor painting when the ground was frozen and the sun ducked behind clouds before dinner. I picked up what I could: indoor maintenance gigs, fixing insulation, the occasional plumbing issue. But I wasn't making much. Claire, never one to meddle, still found ways to help. She started inviting me over for meals more frequently, packed leftovers in containers I could take home, casually slipped me books she thought I might enjoy. Books she'd picked up knowing they'd sit on my nightstand until I found the time to read them. One night, after a long day of sealing drafty windows in an old Victorian house, I showed up at her place exhausted and barely hungry. She took one look at me, set down her glass of wine, and wordlessly handed me a bowl of soup, hot bread, and a thick pair of socks. I didn't need to explain anything. She just knew. That's the thing about real companionship. There's no need to spell it all out. You simply become each other's answers before the question's even been asked. But as winter dug in, something began to simmer just beneath the surface. Claire had been receiving more calls lately. Emails, texts, inquiries. Her business was growing, and she was being offered contracts in larger cities, potential collaborations with elite clients that would require travel or even relocation. I could see it weighing on her. The way she lingered over her planner, the subtle way she'd pause mid-conversation, as if her mind had just jumped ahead to some problem she hadn't solved yet. I didn't push. I knew she'd tell me when she was ready. But the longer she waited, the more I felt the distance creeping in, like cold air seeping through a cracked window you hadn't noticed before. Then one evening, after a dinner that felt quieter than usual, she finally said it. She'd been offered a 3-month contract in Portland. It was a massive opportunity, an event series with a major nonprofit, one that could elevate her reputation nationally. She looked at me cautiously, as she told me, as if bracing for disappointment or resistance. But I just nodded. "That's amazing," I said, meaning it. "You have to do it." She smiled, a little sadly. "That's the thing. I want to. But I also don't want to leave." That night, as we sat on the couch, her head on my chest, and the fire casting long shadows on the walls, I couldn't help but wonder what would happen when she went. We hadn't talked about a future in concrete terms. We hadn't made promises about forever. But the thought of 3 months without her, it didn't feel like space. It felt like absence. Still, I didn't tell her not to go. That wouldn't have been love. That would have been fear dressed up as possession. Instead, I offered her what she'd always offered me: support. "We'll figure it out," I told her. "Whatever it looks like." And I meant it, even though part of me ached at the thought of her being gone. She left on a cold Tuesday morning, suitcase in hand, scarf wrapped tightly around her neck. I drove her to the airport, fingers gripping the steering wheel a little tighter than usual. When we got to the terminal, she leaned over and kissed me, soft, slow, lingering. "You're the best thing that's happened to me in a long time," she whispered. "Don't forget that." I watched her walk away, my chest hollow and full all at once. And as the automatic doors closed behind her, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't just waiting for her return. I was holding space for her, believing that what we'd built wouldn't crumble just because we were apart for a little while. The first week was the hardest. Her absence echoed in everything: the way my mornings were quieter, the way her laughter no longer bounced through my kitchen, the empty chair across from me at dinner. But we called. We texted. Sometimes we just stayed on the line without speaking, the silence a placeholder for something deeper. And every time I heard her voice, every time she sent a picture of a rain-soaked Portland street or a room she'd designed, I felt more certain. We weren't done. We were just in a different chapter. Time stretched longer than I expected in her absence, not in the sense that it dragged, but in the way it expanded and created room for reflection. At first, I threw myself into work, taking on odd jobs, fixing broken heaters, repairing busted locks, resealing attic windows, anything to keep my hands moving and my mind from wandering too far. Claire's departure had left a quiet space behind, not empty exactly, but paused. Every now and then, I'd still reach for a second mug when brewing coffee in the morning, catch myself turning my head to comment on something while watching the news, only to remember the other side of the couch was unoccupied. Still, that space wasn't desolate. It was filled with echoes. Soft laughter during late-night conversations, the rustle of her coat when she walked through my door, the familiar cadence of her voice humming along to music as she cooked. I didn't try to mute it. I let it play. We talked as often as our schedules allowed. Claire was busy, very busy. The Portland project turned out to be even more demanding than expected, with tight deadlines, demanding clients, and a constantly shifting set of expectations. But she was thriving. I could hear it in her voice, the way she lit up when describing the setup for a fundraiser gala she was coordinating, or the satisfaction when a client emailed her glowing feedback. She was in her element, and even through the phone, I felt proud. And yet, beneath all that pride was a trace of selfish longing. There were moments, brief and sometimes petty, when I wished she wasn't quite so successful, when I wanted the project to be just challenging enough to satisfy her, but not so rewarding that it made her consider staying longer than planned. Despite the distance, we started finding new rhythms. We did movie nights remotely, syncing up a film and hitting play at the same time while texting each other commentary in real time. I mailed her a care package once a week, filled with little things that reminded me of her favorite tea, a candle that smelled like cedarwood, a handwritten note folded between the pages of a book I knew she'd love. She sent me postcards, even though it would have been easier to text. She said there was something romantic about putting ink to paper and trusting it to find its way. I kept them all pinned above my desk, each one a small reminder that we were choosing each other, even with thousands of miles between us. Around the 6-week mark, things began to shift. Not in a bad way, but in a way that felt inevitable. Claire's messages got shorter, sometimes delayed. Our calls grew less frequent, not because of any tension, but because life was simply happening to both of us. She had events running back to back, and I was juggling more local work than I expected. One evening, after a long day of installing a custom set of bookshelves for a retired couple, I came home to a missed call from her and a short message that read, "Crazy day. I'm okay. Miss you. Will call when I can." I stared at it longer than I should have, my thumb hovering over the keyboard, wondering what to say. I typed and deleted 3 replies before settling on, "No rush. Just glad you're okay. Miss you too." It was honest, but it didn't capture the ache in my chest, the one that whispered, "I wish I was still part of your every day." That night, I sat outside on the back step of my apartment with a beer in hand and the February chill biting at my neck. I tried to name what I was feeling. It wasn't jealousy, and it wasn't fear. It was more like displacement, the slow realization that the more we grew individually, the harder it might be to grow together. Still, I wasn't ready to give up on us. I had to believe that all this distance, this weight, was building something stronger. Then, something unexpected happened. Claire called me one night sounding different. She wasn't flustered or excited. She was quiet, thoughtful. She told me she'd been offered an extension, another 3 months in Portland, with even bigger opportunities tied to it. They wanted her to oversee a full regional rollout of a new design initiative. It was the kind of offer most professionals would dream of. But she didn't sound happy. She asked me what I thought. I paused. I didn't want to lie, but I also didn't want to be selfish. So I told her the truth, that I wanted her to come home. But more than anything, I wanted her to do what was right for her. There was a long silence. Then she said something I didn't expect. I think what's right for me is you. I didn't know how to respond. I just sat there, holding the phone to my ear, heart pounding. She went on to say that she realized success wasn't about the size of the stage she was on. It was about who she came home to. And even though she was proud of the work she'd done, she missed having a hand to hold at the end of a long day. She missed me. She missed us. She'd already turned down the offer. The relief that washed over me was immediate and overwhelming. But so was the humility. She had given up something big, not because I asked her to, but because she chose to. That choice meant everything. Claire returned just as winter loosened its grip on the city. The sky was still gray most days, the wind still sharp, but there were faint signs of spring. Buds nudging out on the trees along Main Street, the first brave daffodils peeking through cracks near the curb. I waited at the station with a quiet flutter in my chest that I hadn't felt in years, like I was 19 again, and seeing someone for the first time with all the promise of something new. She stepped off the train looking like she belonged in both worlds, hers and mine. Her coat was the same one I remembered, a deep maroon that hugged her figure, and her hair was pulled back, windblown from the ride. But it wasn't the coat, or her hair that caught me. It was the look in her eyes. Tired, yes, but peaceful. And when she saw me, everything about her face softened. She dropped her bag and wrapped her arms around me like it was where she'd been trying to get back, to all along. We didn't say much that first hour, just the occasional smile, the kind that said more than words could. Back at my place, I made her tea the way she liked it. Chamomile with a touch of honey, and she settled on the couch with her legs tucked under her, sighing like she was finally able to exhale. I sat next to her, not touching, not pressing, just being there. The quiet between us wasn't awkward anymore. It felt earned, lived in, like the pause at the end of a meaningful sentence. Later that evening, after dinner and after the dishes were done, we sat on the balcony wrapped in an old wool blanket, watching the city lights flicker on below. She leaned into me, her head resting on my shoulder, and whispered, "Thank you for waiting." I didn't need to say anything back. She already knew. Over the next few weeks, our lives slowly remeshed. Not in the rushed, tangled way that happens when two people force things to fit, but in a deliberate, thoughtful rhythm. Claire didn't move in immediately. She kept her apartment, her independence, her own pace. But more often than not, her evenings ended at my place, her books on the nightstand beside mine, her slippers waiting near the door. We took our time because we knew what we had was real, and real things didn't need to be rushed. She returned to freelance consulting, choosing projects that let her stay rooted while still stretching her skills. And me? I kept working, one job at a time, but now with a renewed sense of purpose. I wasn't just saving for a rainy day anymore, I was building something. A future, a shared story. My friends started noticing the change before I said anything. I laughed more. I showed up to weekend poker nights without bailing last minute. I stopped filling the silences with sarcastic jokes and started asking about their lives instead. One night, my buddy James pulled me aside and said, "You're different, man. Happier. Lighter." And I realized he was right. Claire hadn't saved me, but she reminded me I was worth saving. And sometimes, that's all it takes. Someone seeing you clearly enough to help you see yourself. We began spending Sundays with her niece Emily, a smart and sassy 8-year-old with a stubborn streak that reminded me of Claire. We'd take her to the science museum, to the park, to the ice cream shop that still served scoops the size of your face. Watching Claire with her niece was like watching sunlight bend through glass. Quiet, beautiful, transformative. She'd always claimed she wasn't the mom type, but the way she kneeled to tie Emily's shoe or patiently explained constellations on the museum ceiling told another story. One night, after Emily had gone home, I asked Claire if she ever wanted kids of her own. She didn't answer right away. Then she said softly, "I never let myself want it before. It always felt too risky, like wanting more than I was allowed. But now?" She reached for my hand. "Now it doesn't feel scary. It feels possible." It was the first time I let myself picture it too. Birthday parties, sleepy school mornings, first bike rides, scraped knees. A whole messy, beautiful life built together. And even though we weren't there yet, not even close, Just the thought of it made something inside me settle. Not because I needed it to be complete, but because with Claire, every version of the future felt like home. Of course, not everything was easy. There were disagreements, small ones usually, about dishes or which movie to watch, or whether garlic belonged in mashed potatoes. It does, by the way. But even our arguments were different now. They didn't spiral. They didn't cut. They were just bumps in the road we knew how to navigate. One evening, after a long day, I snapped at her for something trivial. Instead of retreating, she looked at me calmly and said, "You're allowed to be tired, but don't take it out on me." I apologized. She forgave me, and we moved on. That kind of emotional maturity doesn't come from fairy tales. It comes from people who've lived enough to know that love isn't about perfection. It's about persistence. As the season shifted fully into spring, I realized that somewhere along the way, my apartment had started to feel like ours. Not because of any dramatic declaration, but because of the little things. Her mug next to mine, her scarf on the coat rack, her laughter in the walls. I once told her, half joking, that she'd started haunting my place like a benevolent ghost. She smiled and replied, "Good. Maybe now it'll finally feel alive." Spring melted into early summer like a slow, unfolding symphony, and with it came a gentle, persistent rhythm to our days that felt like music played just for us. Claire and I settled into something neither of us had expected, but both of us quietly longed for. Consistency without monotony, affection without obligation, a companionship that allowed room to breathe. We weren't chasing some picture-perfect romance. We were living something far more real. And perhaps the most surprising part was how naturally it all unfolded. There were no dramatic turning points, no sudden confessions screamed through thunderstorms or chased through airport terminals. It was in the way her fingers curled instinctively around mine when we walked down the street. The way I remembered to pick up her favorite chocolate bar without her asking. The way she paused her work when I looked like I'd had a rough day. And the way I always stayed up until she got home, even if her meetings ran late. These small things wove together into something stronger than declarations, a quiet promise written between the lines of our everyday. Her sister, Denise, invited us to a family barbecue one weekend, and that's when I realized how much deeper we'd gotten into each other's lives. Claire's family had heard about me, of course, but being there in the middle of the lawn, with kids running circles around my legs and her uncle handing me a beer like I was already part of the tribe, it hit different. I wasn't just the guy Claire was seeing. I was Ethan, the one who made her laugh again, the one who showed up. Her parents were more formal, polite, but slightly guarded, like they didn't quite know how to place me. But Claire's mother watched the way I carried plates, the way I looked at her daughter when she wasn't paying attention, and at one point she leaned in and whispered, "Thank you." I wasn't sure for what. Maybe for not hurting her, maybe for helping her soften, or maybe just for staying. But I nodded, and she nodded back, and in that moment, something unspoken passed between us. I was in, not as a replacement for anyone who came before, but as a man who was present now. That evening, Claire and I walked back to the car slowly, the sky streaked orange and lavender from the setting sun. She was barefoot, heels dangling from her fingers, and her face glowed from the heat and laughter of the day. "You handled them well," she said. "They're not easy to impress." I laughed and told her I wasn't trying to impress anyone. "Good," she said, "because the only person who really needs to see you is me." She stopped then, turned to me in the middle of the sidewalk and kissed me. Not a dramatic kiss, not movie scripted or fevered, just full, intentional, like she was making a decision. And I kissed her back like I already had. The next week brought one of those moments that sneak up and show you how much you care. Claire came down with the flu, the real kind. Fever, chills, zero energy. Normally fiercely independent, she tried to push through the first day on her own. I found her curled up on her couch, wrapped in 3 mismatched blankets, refusing to call. It quits on her laptop even though her eyes could barely stay open. "I'm fine," she mumbled, and then coughed so hard she scared the cat. I took the laptop from her lap without asking, tucked the blankets around her more tightly, and brought her ginger tea and cold compresses. I didn't leave her side. I read to her when she couldn't focus. I slept in a chair next to her couch the first night, and on the floor the second. And when her fever finally broke, and she blinked awake like she wasn't sure where she was, she whispered, "You stayed?" I just smiled. Where else would I be? That was the night she said it. Not as a joke, not as a test, just as a simple truth. "You know," she murmured as she drifted back to sleep, "you're the first man I've ever really trusted to take care of me, not fix me. Just be there." I didn't respond right away. I let the words settle, heavy and warm like a weighted blanket. And in that stillness, I realized it wasn't just her leaning on me. I leaned on her too. Not because I was weak, but because I finally could. In the days that followed, as Claire recovered and spring tilted into the golden warmth of June, I found myself daydreaming about next steps. Not in a pressure-filled way. Not in a let's get rings and venues sort of way. But in the simple act of picturing her in my life 5 years from now. 10. Would we still be watching documentaries with takeout containers between us on Friday nights? Would we be the couple who debated over furniture pieces in antique stores? Would we adopt a dog together? Would we grow old? And every time I let my mind wander down those paths, I didn't feel panic. I felt peace. Claire, too, began making subtle shifts. She cleared a drawer in her dresser for me. I noticed her ordering double the coffee beans she normally bought. She started marking her calendar with joint plans instead of solo ones. Once, I caught her staring at me over the edge of her coffee mug, her expression soft, thoughtful. "You know," she said, "I spent so many years building walls. Now it just feels good to have someone inside them." The weeks rolled into each other with that kind of easy rhythm that only comes when two people stop pretending they're just passing through each other's lives and start acting like they've always been meant to orbit side by side. Claire's health returned, and with it, the subtle vibrancy in her movements I hadn't even realized had dimmed while she was ill. Her energy was back, not in a whirlwind kind of way, but in the gentle hum of her laughter when she'd pass me a cup of tea, or the way she'd place her hand on my shoulder as she leaned in to see what I was working on. There was a quiet reassurance between us now, like we had weathered something small but meaningful, and it had given our bond a new kind of depth. She started asking me about my past, not the surface-level stuff I'd shared before, but the real, unpolished details. What had shaped me, what scared me, what I regretted, what I hoped for. I told her about my dad and the long shadow he cast, not because he was cruel, but because he was so absent even when he was around. I shared how, for the longest time, I thought love was just waiting for someone to notice you were drowning before it was too late. Claire listened, never interrupted, and when I finished, she simply nodded and said, "You deserve more than survival, Ethan." And in that moment, I believed it, because she did too. On a humid Saturday, we took a drive upstate, no destination. No timeline, just open road and a shared playlist that made her sing along off-key while drumming the steering wheel. We stopped at a fruit stand on the side of the road where she bought too many peaches and insisted we eat one on the spot, juices dripping down our wrists as we laughed like teenagers. It was ridiculous and messy and perfect. Later, we found a quiet little lake tucked behind a grove of trees, the kind of place you'd never find unless you got lost on purpose. We sat on a rickety bench by the water, shoes off, our toes grazing the surface as dragonflies flitted nearby. Claire tilted her head against my shoulder and said, "You know, for someone who only joked about marrying me, you're making it really hard not to take that seriously." I smiled, brushed her hair back, and said, "Who's joking?" She turned to look at me. Really look. And something passed between us. An unspoken understanding that neither of us had said the words yet, but we both already felt them. Back in the city, life tried its best to intrude. Work deadlines, phone calls from my brother about our mom's health, a minor flood in Claire's office that set her whole schedule back by 2 weeks. The stress was real, the tension crept in. But this time, we didn't pull away from each other. We leaned in. When Claire was swamped, I brought her takeout and made her laugh until she remembered how to breathe. When I got the news that my mom's condition might be more serious than we thought, she sat beside me through the call, her hand never leaving mine. And when we had our first real fight, About something dumb like how I always left my shoes by the door and how she never finished her coffee. We didn't retreat into silence or stubborn pride. We argued, yes, but then we sat in the discomfort and came out the other side with more understanding, more grace. "We're not perfect," she said later that night as we curled into each other on the couch. "But I think we're right." That fall, Claire invited me to a fundraiser gala her company was sponsoring. I'd never been to anything remotely that formal, and I spent way too much time trying to tie the rental bow tie and worrying if I'd embarrass her. But when she stepped out in a navy blue dress that clung and shimmered in all the right places, everything else faded. But their past? That's a story we only hear in fragments, glimpses, half-truths softened by time. And yet, it's part of them. Part of the person we wake up beside. The next morning, the letter was gone. I didn't ask where it went, and she didn't bring it up again. But something had shifted. Not in a catastrophic way, but in the kind of way that makes you double-check the strength of your foundations. We were still solid, still laughing at shared jokes and reaching for each other in the dark, but now there was a layer beneath the comfort, an awareness of everything unspoken. Over the next few days, I found myself thinking less about Elliot and more about what it means to love someone fully, without editing their past. Claire wasn't a blank page. When I met her, she was a book already in progress, filled with stories I hadn't read, and maybe never would. And wasn't that true of all of us? That we carry around invisible chapters, folded notes in forgotten drawers, people who shaped us just by being there and then not being there? I started to see the beauty in that. In the fact that we weren't each other's firsts, but we might be each other's last. That what we had wasn't purer because it was new, but because it was chosen, again and again, in full view of everything that came before. One Sunday afternoon, as we were walking through the park with steaming paper cups of coffee and gloves interlaced, she stopped by a bench and looked at me with an expression that was softer than I'd ever seen. "You okay?" she asked. "Yeah," I said. "Better than okay. I was just thinking, I don't need to know every name, every scar. I just need to know that I'm part of the story you're writing now." She smiled then, slow and full. "You're more than part of it," she said. "You're the reason I started writing again." We sat down on the bench, watching kids toss leaves into the air like confetti. And I realized that what we were building wasn't just a relationship. It was a life. One stitched together not in spite of the past, but because of it. And maybe that was the secret. That love wasn't about being the only one who'd ever made them feel something. It was about being the one they wanted to feel everything with, from here on out. The one they turned to, not away from, when old letters surfaced and old doubts crept in. That afternoon, the sun dipped behind the trees, and the light filtered through in slanted gold. And for the first time in days, I felt something settle. Not closure, exactly, but peace. The kind that comes when you stop trying to rewrite history and start living the story in front of you. The first snow arrived earlier than expected, blanketing the city in quiet and changing the way sound moved through the streets. Muffled footsteps, distant laughter, the low hum of life moving at half speed. Claire and I had fallen into a rhythm by then. Grocery runs together, shared calendars on the fridge, an unspoken agreement that most dinners would be cooked side by side, even if it was just eggs and toast. There was comfort in the routine, in the small, predictable ways we belonged to each other. But as the holidays approached, so did something heavier. An invitation arrived from her parents, handwritten in her mother's unmistakable cursive, inviting us both to spend Christmas at their place in Vermont. It was the kind of thing couples did, of course. A milestone. But milestones have weight, especially when they carry ghosts. Claire hadn't been back in years, not since the divorce. She'd spoken of the house before, the frozen lake behind it, the smell of pine that clung to her coat all winter, the way her father always burned the cinnamon rolls. But there was tension in those memories, too. A certain brittleness that crept into her voice when she recalled the holidays. I asked her if she wanted to go, and she hesitated, just long enough for me to notice. "I do," she said finally. "But I'm afraid of what it will stir up." And so we packed, carefully. like we were going into emotional weather. The drive took 6 hours, winding through increasingly quiet towns and snow-laced trees, her hand resting on my thigh most of the way, occasionally squeezing just to remind herself I was there. When we arrived, the house looked exactly like she'd described. 2 stories, pale blue shutters, wreaths on every window like it had been plucked from a postcard. Her mother opened the door with a tight smile, equal parts warmth and tension, as if trying to figure out which version of Claire had arrived. Her father hugged her like he wasn't sure how long it would last. I was greeted with polite nods, and the kind of cautious curiosity reserved for men who might stay. Inside, the house was heavy with tradition. Mantels stuffed with garland, ceramic angels perched on every surface, the scent of cloves and old wood. Claire seemed to shrink a little in that space, her edges softening, her voice quieter. We slept in her old room, still painted a shade of lavender, with childhood drawings framed on the wall like artifacts from another life. That first night, as we lay beneath the floral quilt she'd once detested, she whispered, "This place makes me feel like I'm 17 again, like I should be bracing for something." I didn't press. Some places don't offer explanations, only memories. Over the next few days, I watched her navigate her past with careful grace. There were old neighbors to greet, traditions to reenact, stories that were told and retold with varying degrees of laughter and pain. Her mother asked about our plans in a way that wasn't really about the holidays. "So, are you two thinking of staying in the city long term? Or something more permanent?" Claire smiled but didn't answer. Later, in the kitchen, she looked at me with that same expression I'd seen the night I asked about Elliot. Not defensive, just searching for the words. "I don't know what more permanent means anymore," she said. "Isn't this already permanent? The way we wake up together? The way you know how I take my tea?" I nodded. "It is. But I think she meant marriage." Claire let out a breath. Not annoyed, just tired. Everyone always thinks love has to graduate into something. What if this quiet, chosen, daily thing is enough? I didn't argue, because I wasn't sure either. And yet, later that night, as snow fell heavy against the window and the only light came from the flicker of the old fireplace, I imagined us in this very house one day, older, slower, but still folding into each other on a couch after dinner. I saw her in the kitchen, teaching a niece how to roll dough, laughing at something I couldn't hear. I saw permanence, not the kind people expect, but the kind that sneaks up and roots itself quietly, deeply. On Christmas morning, we exchanged gifts privately before the rest of the house stirred. I gave her a framed photo I'd taken months ago, one she didn't know I'd printed. Her, on the balcony laughing, arms outstretched as if catching the wind. She touched the frame with a kind of reverence. "You always show me to myself," she said. Her gift to me was simpler, but no less powerful. A notebook, leather-bound with the first page already filled in. Her handwriting, elegant and sure. "For everything you see that I don't. For the light you hold up when mine flickers. For us." We didn't need vows. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But in that moment, in that house, surrounded by the past and fumbling toward the future, we were something undeniably real. Later that evening, as we bundled up and stepped outside into the bitter cold, she took my hand and led me to the lake behind the house. It was frozen over, just as she'd said, silent and still and endless. We stood there in the quiet, no need to fill the air with words. Her breath formed clouds. Mine matched the rhythm. And then, almost shyly, she said, "I used to come here, when I was younger, and wonder what it would feel like to not be waiting anymore, to not be hoping someone would finally choose me back." I tightened my grip on her hand. "You're not waiting now," I said. "You're home." She turned to me, eyes bright, and nodded. And though the world around us was cold, I felt something settle deep inside. Something warm, steady, unshakable. We had made it through the ghosts and the questions, through the memories and the weight of what might come next. And in the stillness of that frozen moment I realized, we already were. We returned to the city just after New Year's. The kind of return where the holiday lights still flickered in windows, but the energy had already shifted. People were back, to rushing, back to emails, to promises made in the haze of champagne and midnight kisses. Our apartment, still faintly scented with pine from a wreath long past its prime, felt smaller somehow. Maybe it was the contrast to the wide quiet of Vermont, or maybe it was just that post-holiday compression when real life squeezes back in. Claire unpacked slowly, one sweater at a time, folding everything carefully as if reluctant to let go of the space she'd made for herself in that house. I noticed her looking out the window more, watching the bare trees sway, her thoughts clearly miles away. She said she felt fine, just adjusting. But there was something under the surface, something tight in the way she smiled, something measured in her voice. I, on the other hand, had returned to a flurry of messages. A gallery owner I'd met at a dinner party months ago had finally reached out with an offer, an invitation to do a solo show, small but significant, in a space downtown. It wasn't just the kind of thing I'd wanted. It was the kind of thing I hadn't let myself want too much, just in case it never came. And yet, there it was. A door cracked open. The catch? The show would be in June. Just 6 months to prepare, and I'd need to produce an entirely new collection, cohesive, elevated, and emotionally clear. The kind of pause that means something but doesn't ask to be named. In the days that followed, I threw myself into the work. I dusted off old notebooks, studied light obsessively, wandered the city with my camera slung over my shoulder, trying to capture not just beauty, but truth. The kind of truth that lives in cracks, in chipped paint and tired eyes, in the shadows between moments. Claire encouraged me, brought me coffee, kissed my temple while I edited late into the night. But I could feel a new kind of distance forming. Not resentment, not exactly. Just absence, like a shift in gravity. She was writing more again, sometimes waking before dawn and scribbling in her notebook with a kind of intensity I hadn't seen in months. We shared the same space, but less of the same time. Meals grew quieter, our conversations more logistical. I told myself it was temporary. Creative seasons demanded solitude. But late at night, when she rolled to her side and didn't immediately reach for me, I wondered if solitude had become something else. Then came the offer. A friend of Claire's from grad school had recommended her for a position at a nonprofit literary organization, part editorial, part mentorship, based out of Portland. It would mean steady income, a chance to edit again, and a move across the country. When she told me, she was already half apologizing. "It's not a decision," she said quickly. "Just a possibility, a flattering one." But her eyes lit up in a way that made something twist in my chest. Portland. 1,000 conversations we'd never had suddenly rushed forward, about long-term plans, about where we saw ourselves not just next year but 5 years from now. Until then, the future had been something soft and foggy, filled with gentle maybes. But now it was demanding form, shape, direction. I didn't say no. I didn't even flinch. I just nodded and said, "That sounds like something you'd be amazing at." But later that night, while washing dishes alone, I stared out the kitchen window and felt like the apartment was shrinking even more. For days, we danced around the subject, like it was a bruise we couldn't stop bumping into. We'd talk about dinner, about friends, about bills, but never about that. Until finally, on a cold Sunday afternoon, Claire sat cross-legged on the floor beside me, her expression open and tired. "Do you ever wonder," she began, "what parts of ourselves we've muted for the sake of peace?" The question hung between us like steam. "I love this," she continued. "You. Us. This life. But sometimes I think we've both been editing quietly, in the margins, trying not to scare the other off." I didn't answer right away. I thought of all the photos I hadn't taken because I didn't want to miss a moment with her. All the small sacrifices we both made so effortlessly it felt like breathing. "Maybe we have," I said finally. "But maybe that's what real love is. Deciding which parts are worth turning the volume down on and which ones are non-negotiable." She looked at me then, really looked, and I saw the same thing I'd seen in Vermont. The part of her that was always bracing, always waiting for the other shoe to drop. "I'm not leaving," she said quietly. "I haven't even said yes to anything. I just want to know, if I did, if I went, what would that mean for us?" It was a cruel kind of question, because it had no villain, no wrongdoing. Just two people with dreams that might not overlap as perfectly as they once imagined. I reached for her hand. "I don't know," I said. "But I think we need to find out if what we're building is strong enough to stretch without breaking." She nodded, and I could see the relief in her, even if it was only partial. Love, I realized in that moment, wasn't always about answers. Sometimes it was just about staying in the room while the questions echoed off the walls. That night, we lay together in bed, our fingers intertwined like rope. Not in desperation, but in understanding. Neither of us knew what the next chapter looked like. But we knew we weren't done writing it. The weeks that followed were slow and strange, like we were living in parentheses. Nothing had changed outwardly. Our routines remained intact. Our mornings still began with shared coffee, and our nights ended tangled in the same sheets. But underneath, there was a hum of something unspoken. Claire hadn't accepted the offer, yet, but it lived between us like a third presence, casting a quiet shadow on even the most mundane parts of our life. Every small decision. Should we sign up for that wine subscription? Should we replace the aging rug? Should we finally hang the pictures we'd been meaning to? Suddenly felt loaded, as if permanence was no longer assumed. I caught myself hesitating, before making plans too far out, stopping just short of using phrases like, "this time next year." It wasn't doubt in her or in us, not exactly. It was just the awareness that our future, once a gentle blur, we walked toward, without question, now had possible branches we hadn't prepared for. Claire, to her credit, didn't rush anything. She moved through the days with a quiet deliberateness, as though she were weighing every heartbeat. I'd catch her reading in the corner of the couch, notebook nearby, occasionally jotting down thoughts she wouldn't share. At first, I thought she was distancing herself, retreating into a world where I couldn't follow. But then I realized she wasn't pulling away. She was making space. Space to think. Space to want things. Space to figure out if the dreams she'd put on hold were still hers, or just habits of an earlier version of herself. One night, while brushing her teeth, she said, "What scares me is how much I want both. The life we're building and the version of me that lives out there, in that other city, doing work that lights me up again. I don't want one to cancel out the other." I leaned against the doorway, watching her in the mirror. "Maybe they don't have to," I said, though the words felt fragile coming out. Around that time, I started staying out later, not on purpose, but because the hours I spent shooting or editing stretched longer. The city had always been my source material, but now it felt like a canvas I was painting with urgency. Every street corner, every flicker of light, every stranger's face felt more vivid, like I was trying to gather enough of it before something shifted. The gallery show loomed larger in my mind. It wasn't just a career milestone anymore. It was starting to feel like an anchor, a reason to stay planted, a reason to ask her to stay too. But I didn't, because I knew that love can't grow under obligation, and because some part of me was starting to wonder if we were entering the season of testing, not of loyalty, but of alignment. Were we still walking the same path, or just walking next to each other on separate ones? The Portland offer turned into a formal contract. Claire printed it and left it on the kitchen table, not as a statement, but as an invitation. We read it together, side by side, quiet but present. The job was part-time, with room to grow. It included travel, mentorship, creative freedom. It was, in many ways, everything she'd once said she wanted. She looked at me after, eyes searching for something I couldn't quite define. "If I take this," she said slowly, "I'd want to try it for 6 months. Just 6. I wouldn't sell the apartment. I wouldn't call it forever. I'd just go and see." The logic made sense. The timeline felt reasonable. But still, my chest tightened at the thought. Not because I feared losing her, but because I feared getting used to not having her around. What if the stretch that didn't break us slowly unraveled us instead? We spent that weekend deliberately close, like we were rehearsing the absence before it arrived. We made breakfast together with exaggerated tenderness, lingered over coffee, took long walks without checking the time. She wore my sweatshirt. I memorized the sound of her laughter when it echoed off the hallway walls. That Sunday night, we ordered Thai food and sat on the floor, eating out of takeout containers like we had in our early days. It was comforting and devastating all at once. When we'd finished, I turned to her and said, "I don't want you to go, but I also don't want to be the reason you don't." She looked at me then, something deep and sad and grateful in her eyes. "That's exactly why I love you," she said. And I knew in that moment that she was going. The day she left, the apartment didn't feel emptier. It felt paused. Her mug still sat in the dish rack. A pair of earrings rested on the bathroom counter. The blanket she always reached for was folded neatly on the arm of the couch. There was no dramatic departure, no last-minute confessions, just two people hugging a little too long at the airport, promising to try, really try. And then she walked through security, and I watched her disappear around a corner that felt far more symbolic than it should have. The first night alone, I didn't sleep. I walked through our space like a museum, touching things, trying to feel her in them. The silence wasn't loud, but it was heavy, like a weighted blanket I hadn't asked for. But here's the thing. Even apart, we kept showing up. Morning texts, photos of sunsets from opposite coasts, little check-ins, big feelings. We didn't pretend it was easy, but we didn't pretend it wasn't worth it either. I started keeping a list in the back of my notebook. Things to tell her, things to ask, things to remember. She sent me books in the mail with notes scribbled in the margins. "You look like someone I dreamed up," I told her, and she laughed that soft laugh that always made my chest tighten. At the event, she introduced me as my partner, and it landed like a warm anchor in my chest. People eyed us, some with curiosity, some with skepticism, but Claire never flinched. She kept her hand on my arm, her gaze steady, her tone proud. I realized then that whatever doubts I had about fitting into her world didn't matter. She had already chosen to let me into it. Later that night, after too much champagne and stolen moments on the dance floor, we returned to her apartment. She kicked off her heels, pulled her hair down, and collapsed onto the couch with a sigh of relief. I joined her, and we sat there quiet, the city humming outside her windows. "You still think 49 is ready enough?" she asked after a moment. I turned to her, took her hand in mine, and said, "I think I've never been more ready for anything in my life." She didn't cry. She didn't laugh. She just nodded and leaned into me, the silence between us full of every unspoken yes. It wasn't a proposal, not officially, but it was the beginning of one, a shared step towards something lasting, and that was more than enough for now. The days that followed seemed to move with a different kind of momentum, like we were no longer measuring time by clocks or calendars, but by the subtle shifts in our closeness. How her hand would find mine. In a crowded room, how my voice softened when I said her name. Claire didn't need to ask me to stay over anymore. It was just understood. I had a drawer in her bedroom, a mug in her kitchen, and my jacket on the hook by her door. We'd created this slow-burning domesticity that didn't feel like settling. It felt like becoming. It was in the simple things. The way she folded my t-shirts differently than I did, or how she'd switch the station to jazz when I was too tired to talk, letting the notes do the heavy lifting of conversation. I started to learn the rhythms of her life more deeply. When her stress hit its peak, how she preferred her eggs, which cardigan she reached for when she needed comfort. And in return, she began to see the layers of me that others never stayed long enough to understand. The parts that overthought everything. The scars I kept well hidden under humor. The way I sometimes stared too long at nothing at all. One chilly morning, she invited me to a brunch with her sister and niece. I didn't realize the weight of that invitation until she mentioned it in passing. "They're not easy," she said while tying her scarf, "but they're important to me." I took that as code for, "They might not like you." And I was right, at least initially. Her sister Margot was all sharp eyes and polite restraint. She asked pointed questions about my work, my intentions, my stability. Her niece, Nina, a bright and perceptive college senior, seemed to warm to me faster. She asked about my photography, my favorite novels, my music taste. Claire mostly observed, interjecting now and then, as if letting them draw their own conclusions. It was awkward, but not unbearable. By the end of the meal, Margot had thawed just enough to say, "Well, at least he makes you smile," which, judging by Claire's reaction, was high praise. That night, she admitted she hadn't introduced anyone to her family in years, not since her divorce. "I just didn't think anyone would be around long enough," she said. "But you're still here." I kissed her forehead and whispered, "I'm not going anywhere." As autumn settled in, the city transformed into its best self. Leaves turning fire-colored, air crisp with the scent of roasted chestnuts from street vendors, and couples strolling, hand in hand under amber streetlights. It became our season. We carved pumpkins on her balcony, laughed until our stomachs hurt when hers caved in completely. We hosted a small dinner party for our mutual friends, my buddy Tom and his girlfriend, her co-worker Elise and her husband, and I caught myself smiling at the sound of our names said together, not as individuals, but as a unit. One night, we lay on the couch beneath a shared blanket watching an old black-and-white movie, and she said, almost sleepily, "Sometimes I think I waited too long to start over. But then I realize maybe I was just waiting for the right reason." That reason, I knew, was us, and yet, even in the beauty of what we had built, old fears found ways to whisper. Sometimes it was a glance in the mirror, where she'd touch the fine lines around her mouth and sigh. Sometimes it was in the way she hesitated to accept compliments, or the way she said things like, "At my age," like it was a limitation, instead of a milestone. I tried to show her otherwise, not just with words but with actions. I planned a surprise day trip upstate to an apple orchard, just the two of us. We picked apples, drank cider, and lay on a blanket watching clouds pass. "Like lazy dreams, you know what I see when I look at you?" I asked as she stared at the sky. "I see the kind of woman novels are written about. The kind of woman who doesn't just survive but teaches others how to live." She turned to me, eyes soft with disbelief, and for once she didn't deflect or downplay. She just smiled and whispered, "Thank you." That weekend marked a quiet turning point. We didn't label it, but we both felt it. The unspoken shift from lovers to something closer to life partners. We began talking about practical things, combining bills, moving in together officially, what it would look like to share everything, not just the joys, but the responsibilities too. I showed her some of my older photo projects, ones I'd never displayed publicly. She shared essays she'd written years ago, tucked away in folders she never meant to open again. Vulnerabilities became currency, trust, the interest it accrued. We were, without realizing it, building something permanent, not flashy or dramatic, but stable and steady like a lighthouse in fog. And in all of it, I found myself falling harder, not just for the moments that sparkled, but for the mundane ones too. For her sleepy mumble in the morning, the way she always hummed while folding towels, the scent of her shampoo on my pillow. Our love didn't crescendo in grand declarations or extravagant gifts. It deepened in the daily yeses. Yes to showing up. Yes to being patient. Yes to choosing each other over and over again. And I realized that what we had was rare. Not because it was perfect, but because it was chosen. Not rushed or fated, but created, nurtured, and fought for. I didn't need a ceremony or a contract to know she was mine. And yet, some part of me started to imagine what it would feel like to say vows, not for tradition's sake, but as a celebration of everything we had quietly become. I hadn't said it yet, neither had she. But I knew. We were getting close. It started with a quiet shift, subtle, like the way the temperature drops before a storm. There wasn't a single moment I could point to, no sharp words or slammed doors, just the small, nearly invisible recalibrations of two people learning how to share not just space, but history. One evening, while Claire was out with Elise at a gallery opening, I stayed in to organize some things in the living room cabinet, mostly to make room for more of her books, which had started to accumulate on every surface like ivy, as I pulled out a stack of old photo albums and candles we never lit. A small, white envelope slipped from behind a wooden picture frame. My name wasn't on it. In fact, no name was. Just a single word scrawled in blue ink. Elliot. It wasn't sealed. It wasn't hidden well, but it also wasn't something I was meant to find. I held it for a moment, unsure if I was crossing a line by even standing there with it in my hand. I didn't open it. I placed it back where I found it, but the word lingered. Elliot. The name echoed around in my head, like a pebble dropped down a well, its significance unclear but somehow weighty. When Claire came home that night, I couldn't pretend nothing was different. She kicked off her boots and smiled at me from across the room, her eyes warm and a little flushed from wine. But I felt removed, like I was watching a memory instead of a moment. I waited until we were brushing our teeth side by side, both of us tired and quiet in that way couples get after long days. That's when I asked softly, trying to keep it from sounding like an accusation. Who's Elliot? The name hung in the air between us, sterile and foreign in my mouth. She paused mid-brush, then slowly spit into the sink and met my eyes in the mirror. For a long beat, she said nothing, just studied me with a look that was half bracing, half regretful. Then she turned to face me directly. He was someone I used to love, she said. After my divorce, before you. Her voice didn't waver, but her eyes did, flicking away like they couldn't bear to sit still. We never quite became what we were supposed to. Wrong timing. Too many loose threads. I wrote him a letter a few years ago, more for myself than for him. I never mailed it. I just kept it. I nodded slowly, trying to measure what I felt. Jealousy, sure, but something else too. Something more like displacement. That eerie feeling when you realize you're not the first, and you never will be. Claire must have sensed that I was spinning in my own head, because she reached out and placed her palm against my chest. You're not competing with a ghost, she said, almost pleading. You're the only one I've chosen to build something with. Everything before you was weather. I kissed her forehead that night, but sleep didn't come easy. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering about all the versions of her I hadn't met. The ones who loved, lost, changed, and left marks that no one could see. I realized how little we ever truly know about the people we love. We get their present tense, maybe their ambitions for the future. I framed one of her quotes and put it on my desk. We're not fragile. We're just stretching. And it helped in the moments I felt unsure. In the moments I missed her laugh mid-conversation. In the moments I questioned what we were risking, and what we might still become. The first few weeks without Claire were a strange study in contrast. Everything was the same, but nothing felt familiar. Her absence didn't scream, it whispered. It moved subtly through the apartment like a ghost, brushing past me in the spaces we once shared. Her jacket still hung by the door. Her handwriting still lived on the grocery list we never finished. I hadn't touched her side of the bed, not because of some romantic notion, but because I couldn't bear to find out what it felt like to sprawl without her there. The apartment had never been big, but now it felt cavernous, as if every empty chair carried her shape. I found myself keeping the radio on longer, letting the television play quietly in the background just to trick my ears into believing there was another presence in the room. In truth, the silence didn't scare me. It simply reminded me of what I was waiting for. Claire, for her part, kept her promise. We stayed connected. She called every morning, her voice still thick with sleep, and every evening, usually while pacing some unfamiliar Portland sidewalk with earbuds tucked beneath her scarf. She sent me photos of bookstores, street murals, her morning coffee, and a new ceramic mug she'd found at a Saturday market. I could tell she was trying, not just to maintain our rhythm, but to let me in, to bring me along in the details. And I did the same. I'd text her snapshots of the city, the diner where we had our first real fight, the bench we used to sit on in early fall, leaves caught in her hair while she sipped cider. These exchanges, though sweet, sometimes made the distance sharper. It was like holding hands across a canyon. We were still touching, but we could feel the drop between us. We didn't talk about the future much, not in concrete terms. There was a kind of unspoken agreement between us. We were giving this time and space a chance to tell us something, even if neither of us knew exactly what we were listening for. Instead, we focused on the now. How was your day? What did you read? Did you eat? Little rituals that held the shape of love. And yet, under those rituals, there were tremors. I could feel them in the way her voice sometimes hesitated before answering simple questions, or in the slight delay before she replied to a message she would have once answered instantly. It wasn't neglect, it was saturation. She was immersed in something new, something demanding. And I respected that. I wanted her to lose herself in this opportunity. I just didn't know how to stop fearing she might not come back from it. The same. One night, after a particularly long day spent editing a series of moody grayscale portraits for the gallery show, I called her a little later than usual. She answered, hair damp from a shower, the sound of jazz playing softly in the background. She looked happy, tired, but lit from within. I went to a reading tonight, she said. It was, incredible. There's something about being surrounded by people who care about the same weird things you do, you know? I nodded, but something in me ached. I knew exactly what she meant. I'd felt that energy too, in dark rooms, in studios, in spontaneous conversations with other artists who spoke the same invisible language. It wasn't jealousy. It was a kind of mourning for the version of us that had thrived in the simplicity of shared space before we were forced to stretch and interpret love in new ways. We fell asleep on the phone that night, not talking, just listening to each other breathe. It was strangely intimate, more so than I expected. But even that intimacy came with its own sadness, because nothing can replace the feeling of actual weight beside you, the warmth of a familiar body, the half-conscious shuffle she made in the middle of the night to pull the blanket higher. I missed her in layers, physically, yes, but also mentally, emotionally. I missed the way she could look at me and know what I wasn't saying. I missed her voice in the next room. I missed the way her presence filled all the small spaces in my day without asking to. We hadn't said anything definitive yet. There'd been no talk of after Portland, but I could feel the clock ticking, counting down to a moment neither of us had scheduled but both of us knew was coming. The reckoning. And still, in spite of the ache, there was a kind of beauty in it. We were growing, individually, and somehow, still together. I watched her bloom in a city I'd never set foot in a life I had no hand in curating, and I couldn't help but admire her all over again. For her bravery, her honesty, her ability to keep both feet in the present while her heart stretched across state lines. And maybe, in some quiet way, I was blooming too. I'd started pushing myself harder, not just for the gallery show, but in my own sense of identity. I was rediscovering what kind of artist I wanted to be, what kind of man I wanted to become. Not just for her, for me, for the version of me that existed long before we met and would still exist, in some shape, even if she chose a different ending. Then one afternoon, while sifting through emails and tracking photo orders, I found a package on the doorstep. It was small, wrapped in plain brown paper, with her handwriting on the front. Inside was a book of Rilke poems, the same edition she used to keep on her nightstand, the one I'd always seen marked with sticky notes and folded corners. Inside the front cover, she'd written only 2 words, "Still us." I held the book for a long time before opening it. That phrase settled into me like breath, like warmth. It wasn't a promise or a guarantee. It was something softer, an offering. A reminder that no matter what came next, no matter how far we stretched, the thread was still there. That we were still us. Not in the way we were before, but in the way we'd become now. And in that quiet, wordless moment, I believed it. Claire came back in late March, just as the city was beginning to shed its winter skin. The sidewalks were still dusted with salt, and the trees were bare. But there was a scent in the air, wet earth, thawing stone, something like possibility. She arrived on a Thursday afternoon, her suitcase scuffed, her scarf knotted too tightly, like she hadn't quite adjusted to being back. I met her at the train station. No grand gestures, just a quiet smile, a long hug, and a whispered "hey" into her hair. She felt smaller in my arms than I remembered. Or maybe I had just grown, used to holding absence instead. On the ride home, she told me stories about the program, the people she'd met, the writers who reminded her of versions of herself she'd almost forgotten, the workshops that left her both exhausted and invigorated. I listened, really listened, and caught myself smiling at how alive she sounded. But beneath that joy was something I didn't mention, the knowledge that she had built something out there, and I wasn't part of it, not directly, not daily. And now we were strangers to each other's routines, trying to remember the rhythm we once moved in without thinking. Back in the apartment, everything looked the same but felt slightly off, like furniture arranged just an inch from where it used to be. She wandered through the rooms like a guest in a place that still smelled like her, but no longer moved around her. Her toothbrush was still in the cup by the sink. Her favorite tea was still on the second shelf. But time has a way of warping even the most familiar spaces. That night, we cooked dinner together, hands brushing as we reached for utensils, bumping hips by the stove, laughing when she spilled a little wine on the counter. It felt easy for a moment, like slipping into an old sweater. But then, as we sat down to eat, there was a pause. Not awkward, just full. She looked around and said, "It feels like I was gone longer than I was." I nodded, not quite knowing what to say. Some absences stretch wider than the calendar suggests. We talked late into the night, legs tangled on the couch, voices low, not about decisions or plans, but about dreams. Hazy ones, half-shaped ones. She told me she missed falling asleep beside me. I told her I missed hearing her hum in the kitchen, and somewhere between those two confessions was the space we'd been living in, missing each other, but not entirely sure how to close the distance. Over the next few days, we pretended we didn't notice the time slipping away. We visited the bookstore where she used to lose hours, walked past the park where we carved our initials into a bench one drunken October evening. We returned to places that had once been ours, hoping the ghosts of past laughter might stitch us back together. Some moments worked. Her hand in mine felt like home, but others felt performative, like we were reenacting intimacy instead of living inside it. On Saturday morning, I found her standing in front of the window, staring out at the street below. She didn't turn when she spoke. "Have you ever felt like you're supposed to be grateful for something, even when it scares you?" I didn't answer right away. I knew what she was really asking. The offer in Portland had turned into a request, extend her contract another year, this time full-time, with a significant promotion. She hadn't told them yes, but she hadn't said no either. "I think fear and gratitude aren't mutually exclusive," I finally said. "Sometimes, the things that mean the most to us are the ones that shake us the most." That night, I brought out my work in progress, prints for the gallery show, neatly stacked and tucked away in a folder I hadn't shown anyone else. She sat cross-legged on the floor as I laid them out, one by one, watching her reaction. Her eyes didn't dart or scan. She gave each piece her full attention. When she looked up at me, she said, "You're doing the best work of your life." And I knew she meant it, not just as praise, but as recognition. We had both grown in our time apart. That much was undeniable. What remained to be seen was whether we could grow toward each other again, or if we had expanded in opposite directions, like vines climbing different walls. After a long silence, she said, "I don't want to have to choose." And I understood. She wanted the freedom to keep becoming herself, and she wanted me too. But the life we had started together had grown. Roots here, in this city, in this apartment, in these rituals. And the life she was building now lived thousands of miles away. The in-between was not a decision. It was a fracture. On her last night before returning to Portland, we didn't talk much. We lay in bed, bodies curved around each other like parentheses, breathing in sync, eyes open in the dark. I wanted to ask her to stay. I wanted to be selfish. But I knew that would mean asking her to shrink, to trade one kind of wholeness for another. Instead, I whispered, "I don't know how this ends, but I don't want it to end because we were afraid to see what we could survive." She kissed my chest, just over my heart, and said, "Me neither." It wasn't a solution. It wasn't even comfort. But it was enough for the night. enough to get us through one more goodbye. The next morning, I drove her to the airport. It was raining, lightly, but steadily. She held my hand the entire drive, thumb tracing circles on my skin, like a silent prayer. When we reached the terminal, she turned to me and said, "No matter what happens, you're part of my story, not a chapter, a theme." I smiled through the lump in my throat and helped her with her bag. We didn't say goodbye. We just said, "Talk soon," because anything more felt too heavy. I watched her walk away again, her figure growing smaller in the crowd, and I didn't cry. Not because I wasn't hurting, but because for the first time I believed we were still writing this, sentence by sentence, pause by pause, not with certainty, but with care. Back home, I brewed a cup of her favorite tea and stood at the window. She'd stood it just 2 days before. The city moved on outside. Taxis splashed through puddles. A woman walked her dog in a yellow slicker. A kid chased pigeons across the sidewalk. And somewhere, I imagined, Claire was looking out a window. Too, maybe not the same view, but under the same sky. And I thought, love isn't about always being in the same place at the same time. Sometimes, it's about holding the same center, even from different corners of the map. In the weeks after Claire left again, spring arrived in earnest. The trees began to soften with green, the streets warmed with the scent of food trucks and thawing concrete, and the city, as it always did, came back to life. But I felt adrift in it, not broken, just off-axis. I kept moving, kept working, kept answering emails and preparing for the show, but it all felt a few degrees removed from me, like I was watching myself do these things through a window. Claire and I still talked, still texted, still sent each other little snapshots of our days, but the rhythm had shifted. It wasn't anything she did. It wasn't even something I could name. It was just time, doing what time does. It stretches. It pulls. It reveals. She was busier now, and so was I. We'd miss a call here, a reply there. She'd text me, "I'm sorry, today got away from me." And I'd reply, "I get it." And I did, but even understanding carries its own kind of ache. One Saturday afternoon, I walked through the gallery where my show would be held. The walls were bare, the floors still scuffed from a previous exhibit being broken down. The curator walked beside me, pointing at where things would go, asking for titles, for artist statements, for a biography to include in the program. I nodded along, offering answers that felt rehearsed. When she left me alone to take measurements, I stood in the middle of the room and imagined Claire walking through it. I pictured her stopping in front of one of the photographs, arms crossed, eyes narrowed, studying the light the way she always did. Would she come for the opening? I didn't know. We hadn't talked about it yet. I wasn't sure if I wanted to ask or wait for her to offer. Because lately, the idea of asking for too much felt risky. Like if I reached too far, something might give. And maybe that was part of the problem. We were both trying not to be too much for each other, and in doing so, we were becoming less. That night, I found myself scrolling back through old messages, voice memos, blurry photos, inside jokes that once made me laugh out loud. I let the past wash over me, not out of nostalgia, but out of an aching curiosity. How did something so full become so quiet? I played a voicemail from months ago, one where she told me about a poem that made her think of us. Her voice was animated, soft, full of breath and light. I remembered exactly where I was when she sent it, lying in bed, the window cracked open, her laugh still echoing down the hall. Now, I listened from the same bed, but it sounded different. Like an echo from a house I no longer lived in. I didn't cry. I didn't spiral. I just sat with it. Sometimes the hardest thing about love isn't the loss. It's the slow, uncertain erosion of the thing you thought would never wear down. Claire called me the next day, voice bright, talking about a new project she was mentoring. Some young writer who reminded her of herself at 22. I listened, genuinely happy for her, and told her so. But there was a pause afterward, just a second too long. And then she said, "Are you okay?" And I almost said yes. I almost let it pass, but I couldn't. "I miss you," I said. Not as a weapon. Not as guilt, just as truth. I miss us. She was quiet for a moment, then said, I miss us too. But even in that softness, there was something unresolved. She wasn't coming back. Not yet. Maybe not for a while. And I didn't blame her. She had built something out there. She was thriving. And I wanted that for her. But wanting it didn't make it any easier. Over the following week, we both tried harder. More check-ins, more shared photos, more effort. It helped. A little. But effort, when stretched across distance, eventually wears thin. One evening, while video chatting, I asked her directly, do you still see a future here? With me? I hadn't meant to ask it then. Hadn't planned it. But the question came out of me like breath I'd been holding too long. She didn't answer right away. And then, finally, she said, I want to. I really do. But I don't know what that looks like anymore. There it was. The quiet truth. The thing we'd both been circling around for months. Not a lack of love. Just a fog over the road ahead. And the thing about fog is, you can't always see whether there's a bridge or a cliff. After we hung up, I sat with that uncertainty. Let it settle in my bones. It didn't feel like a breakup. It didn't even feel like an ending. Just a recalibration. We were still us. But we were different. And maybe what we needed wasn't to pull each other back, but to give each other enough space to find out what we actually wanted next. Not just as individuals, but as a possible us. I stopped trying to preserve what we had before. It was like trying to keep fresh flowers from wilting. Beautiful while it lasts, but not meant to be frozen in time. Instead, I started focusing on what could still grow. New soil, new light. Not as a backup plan, but as a hope. That Friday, I went back to the gallery, this time with final prints in hand. I stayed late, arranging each piece with deliberate care. As I placed the final photo, a quiet black and white of a couple standing under an awning in the rain, I thought of Claire. I thought of how we had learned to stand in the downpour together, never certain when the storm would pass, but always choosing to stay close. And now we were standing in separate storms, umbrellas in hand, eyes searching the horizon for signs of clearing. But maybe, just maybe, those horizons still curved toward each other. April came in soft, like an apology. The city bloomed in unexpected ways, flower boxes spilling over with color, sidewalks painted in early morning gold. Even strangers seemed to carry a different kind of patience. But inside, I was still living in pause. The gallery show was 2 weeks away, and everything was nearly ready. Framed, labeled, cataloged. There was a strange kind of calm in that, in knowing that I had done what I set out to do. And yet, the more final it all became, the more I felt the ache of something missing. Claire hadn't said whether she was coming. We still talked, though, less frequently now. The silence between our conversations was no longer charged. It was resigned, like two people who still cared, but had begun adjusting to the space between their voices. When she did call, her voice felt familiar and far away at once. She asked thoughtful questions. She laughed at my bad jokes. She noticed things. But still, I could feel the clock in her words, like she was calling from another life, like maybe she already lived there. I stopped trying to interpret it. That had been the hardest lesson to learn. Not everything unsaid was a sign. Sometimes people are just tired. Sometimes love is still present, but quieter, like music coming from the next room. I wanted to ask her so many things. Did she still see me in her future? Did Portland feel like a chapter or a destination? Was she scared too? But I held back. Because when you really love someone, you don't hand them ultimatums disguised as questions. You offer space. You offer patience. You hope they walk toward you of their own choosing. And that was the thing. I wanted to be chosen, not accommodated. Not fit into the margins of a life already written. I wanted to be written into the center, or not at all. One night, a week before the show, I found myself standing in front of a photo I'd almost pulled from the collection. It was a candid shot of Claire taken last fall, her face turned away from the camera, mid-laugh, wind catching the ends of her hair. I had taken it on a whim, thinking it was nothing at the time. But now, Months later, it was the one I kept returning to. It wasn't the most technically impressive. It didn't have the strongest composition or lighting, but it held something else. A pulse. A breath. The feeling of being in love with someone at the exact moment they forget the world is watching. I left it in the show. I gave it no caption. It didn't need one. Anyone who looked at it closely would know it was about love, not the big cinematic kind, the quiet, private kind, the kind that happens in stolen glances and early morning coffee and long, drawn-out goodbyes. A few days later, a letter arrived. An actual letter, handwritten, addressed in Claire's script. No text, no warning. Just an envelope slipped through. The slot one afternoon like something from another decade. I stood in the kitchen for a long time before opening it. My fingers were slow, almost reluctant. Inside was a single page. Not long, but not short either. It was honest. She wrote that Portland had given her something she didn't realize she needed. Space from everything she thought she had to be. She talked about rediscovering her voice, about feeling brave again, about learning how to stand on her own in a way that didn't feel like survival. And then, toward the end, she wrote, "But I also realized that every moment I felt most alive, most proud, most like myself, I wanted to tell you. And I think that means something. I think that still means everything. There was no grand conclusion, no plan, no promise, just a kind of open door. And beneath it, her final line, 'If you still want me in the story, I'd like to come home.' I read it twice, then a third time. Then I sat down at the table and let the weight of it move through me. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't overwhelming. It was steady. It was clear. And after all the waiting, all the second-guessing, all the trying not to hope too much, I finally let myself exhale. She wasn't saying she had all the answers. She wasn't asking me to fix anything. She was just reaching out, palms open, heart exposed. And I realized that was all I'd ever wanted. Not perfection, not certainty, just that willingness to try, to choose, again and again, even when the path wasn't lit. That night I replied, not with a letter, but with a call. She answered on the second ring. "Hey," she said, breathless. And I said, "Hey," back. There was a pause. Then I said, "I want you in the story." That hasn't changed. And she didn't say anything for a second, but I could hear her smile through the phone. The following week, she flew in for the show. I didn't pick her up from the airport. That was her request. She said she wanted to come in quietly. Said she didn't need the moment to be cinematic. I understood. So instead, I waited at the gallery, pacing between prints, adjusting frames that were already straight, heart pounding in a way I hadn't felt in years. When she arrived, I didn't see her at first. She was just suddenly there, standing in the middle of the room, coat still on, eyes scanning the walls. When they landed on me, she smiled, and it was the same smile I had fallen in love with in every season. I walked over, unsure of what to say, but she beat me to it. "You did it," she said, voice thick. "It's beautiful." And just like that, something inside me came loose. I took her hand. I didn't need to ask if she was staying. I didn't need to know what the next 10 years would look like. All I needed was that moment, that yes, that presence, that simple act of showing up. Later that night, after the last guests had left and the gallery had gone quiet, we sat on the floor between two prints and drank wine out of plastic cups. No declarations, no plans. Just two people who had wandered far enough to know what they didn't want to lose. She leaned her head on my shoulder and said, "Whatever we build next, let's not build it from fear." I kissed her temple and said, "No, let's build it from this." And I didn't mean the exhibit, or the wine, or the photographs on the wall. I meant the moment, the willingness, the showing up. And for the first time in a long time, I felt certain. Not about the road ahead, but about who I'd be walking it with. The morning after the show, the city was muted with that kind of gray, gentle stillness that only comes after a long night. We woke late, tangled beneath the sheets, limbs naturally finding their way back to the shape they'd once known so well. No alarms, no obligations. Just the kind of quiet where every sound feels earned. Claire lay beside me, her hair a mess, her eyes still heavy with sleep, and for a moment I didn't say anything. I just looked at her. At the curve of her shoulder, the way the light caught on her cheekbone, the faint smile playing at her lips even in stillness. There was nothing dramatic about it. No fireworks, no sweeping soundtrack. Just a heartbeat, and the subtle knowledge that we were no longer waiting. We had crossed something invisible. We had chosen again, and that was everything. We spent most of that day doing absolutely nothing. She made tea while I cleaned up the kitchen, both of us bumping into each other in familiar ways. She sat on the floor with a bowl of cereal while I scrolled through messages about the show. It felt like falling back into something without realizing you'd ever stepped out. Every gesture was easy again. Her hand finding my lower back as she passed, my instinct to pour her the mug that wasn't chipped, our silent language slipping back into place without effort. Around noon, we stepped outside just to feel the city around us. The sidewalks were dappled in light. Trees finally bloomed in full. And even though the neighborhood hadn't changed, it felt new again with her next to me. We walked with no destination, talking about nothing and everything. What she'd been reading, a funny story from the gallery, some memory we both had but remembered differently. It was like tuning a guitar after it's been sitting for too long. The chords were still there. We just had to find the right key. At a corner cafe, we sat across from each other with coffee and shared a muffin like we had 100 times before. She reached across the table and took my hand, just held it there, her thumb running slow circles across my knuckles. "I miss this," she said, not like a confession, but like a truth. Not just us. This version of me. The one that gets to exist with you. I didn't say anything right away. I just tightened my grip and nodded. Because I understood exactly what she meant. The people we become with the right person aren't versions we manufacture. They're versions we finally let breathe. And I had missed that version of me too. The one who slowed down. The one who noticed the light on a windowsill and the tone in a voice and the story in someone's eyes. Being with her made me pay attention to things I might have otherwise passed by. That afternoon, back at the apartment, we did something small but significant. We opened the drawer with all the paperwork, the bills, the old receipts, the tangled cords, and the lease agreement. We started talking about what came next, not just where we'd live, but how. She told me she wasn't ready to leave Portland forever, but she was ready to be here again. She wanted to make this work, but she also needed a little more time to transition. So we talked options. Could she spend part of the year there, part here? Could we try living by coastal for a while, just until we both felt clear? I felt the old anxiety rise up, the fear of losing momentum, of stretching something too far again. But then I looked at her and remembered that we'd already survived that. What we were talking about now wasn't distance. It was logistics, and logistics didn't scare me anymore. As long as she was choosing this with me, I'd find a way to stretch. We spent the rest of the weekend in what can only be described as gentle domesticity, folding laundry, cleaning out the fridge, picking up groceries. She reorganized the spice rack while humming something soft, and I watched her, grateful for every ordinary minute. We didn't talk about weddings or forever or 5-year plans. We didn't need to. What we were doing was better. We were rooting back into each other, slowly, deliberately, in the most mundane and sacred way. I showed her a short film I was working on, and she offered feedback that was sharp, kind, and utterly her. She read a new essay to me, and I told her what made me pause, what made me feel. These were the exchanges that mattered. This was the fabric we were weaving again, thread by thread. On Sunday evening, we walked down to the river. The sky was streaked with pink, and the city lights were beginning to flicker on, one window at a time. She leaned into me as we stood by the railing, both of us watching a ferry glide slowly across the water. "I don't need everything figured out," she said, voice low, "but I do know I want us to be part of whatever I figure out next." I nodded. "We don't have to build fast," I said, "just strong." And she smiled, eyes soft, because she knew that wasn't a line. That was a promise. We stood there a while longer, not speaking, just letting the moment be full. And, For the first time in what felt like a long stretch of story, I wasn't wondering what would happen next. I was simply here, with her. That night, she stayed. Not for a weekend, not for a visit, but with the intention of beginning again. She left her suitcase at the foot of the bed and unpacked slowly. Hung a few pieces of clothing in the closet. Set her notebook on the nightstand. It wasn't everything, but it was enough. Enough to know this wasn't a stopover. This was a re-entry. A homecoming, not to a place, but to each other. Later, as we lay in bed, our legs tangled in the room dim, I turned to her and said, "Whatever we build this time, let's build it on purpose." She nodded, eyes already drifting shut, and whispered, "On purpose. Every day." And just like that, we began again. Spring turned into summer like a secret. The transition didn't announce itself. It just arrived one morning in the warmth of the pavement and the way the light hung a little longer in the evenings. Claire and I moved through the season gently. No declarations, no labels. Just the quiet rhythm of people who had found each other again and weren't in a hurry to define what that meant. We still had our own lives. She flew back to Portland. Once a month for work, I spent more time than ever in the studio. But the difference now was the intention. We had stopped orbiting and started choosing. Not once, but daily. There was a peace in that. A steadiness I hadn't known I needed. Love, I was learning, didn't have to feel like a fever. It could feel like water, like air, like waking up beside someone and realizing your first thought of the day isn't about fear. It's about gratitude. We didn't pretend things hadn't changed. We talked about it often, sometimes while folding laundry or over late-night tea. She told me how much she'd needed Portland, not for escape, but for expansion. She needed to remember who she was outside of the relationship, outside of the expectations, outside of who she thought she had to be. And I understood that more than I expected to. I told her how the solitude had shaped me too, how it made me sharper as an artist, more grounded as a man. We both knew that what we had now wasn't the same love we started with. It was older, wiser, a little more scarred but infinitely more real. It didn't flinch under pressure. It didn't ask to be proven. It just asked to be honored. There were still hard days. Moments when work overwhelmed us, when old habits crept in, when one of us would retreat into silence and the other would forget how to knock. But now, instead of letting the distance grow, we reached. We talked. We stayed. That, more than anything, became our new foundation. Not flawless communication, but persistent willingness. We weren't trying to win anymore. We were trying to understand. One night, after a long week, I came home to find her on the balcony, barefoot, reading. I sat beside her, and for a long while we didn't speak. Then she said, "Sometimes I look at you and realize this is what I was always waiting for. Not someone to save me. Just someone to stay." I didn't have an answer for that. I didn't need one. I just reached for her hand, and we stayed there until the sky turned dark. By August, the apartment felt fully lived in again. Her books were stacked everywhere. My camera gear cluttered the corner. Our lives were no longer in parallel. They were braided. Some nights we cooked together in silence, both of us lost in thought but tethered by presence. Some nights we argued, not out of fear, but out of trust, because we'd stopped being scared of what disagreement might mean. And some nights, we danced in the kitchen to songs we didn't even know, barefoot and laughing, like people who'd finally stopped waiting for permission to enjoy what they had. There was no rush toward a ring or a ceremony. That didn't mean we weren't committed. It just meant we knew the shape of our love didn't need an audience. It just needed tending. Daily. Quietly. Like a garden that no longer hoped to be noticed, only to bloom. One Saturday, we took a train upstate, not for any special reason, just to get out of the city. We spent the afternoon wandering trails, eating sandwiches by a lake, letting the silence between us be a comfort instead of a question. At one point, we sat on a rock overlooking the water, legs stretched out, the sun warm on our faces. She turned to me and asked, Do you think we'll look back at this part of our life and see it as the beginning? I smiled, eyes half closed. I think we'll look back and see it as the part where we finally stopped running. From the future. From ourselves. From each other. She nodded, then leaned her head on my shoulder. And in that moment, I realized the story we were writing was no longer about searching. It was about arrival. When fall began to creep in again, with its familiar amber light and evening chill, we didn't dread it. We welcomed it. It was our season, after all, the one where everything had begun, and unraveled, and begun again. One night, we found ourselves carving pumpkins on the balcony like we had the first year. The shapes were lopsided, our hands sticky with pulp, but we laughed just the same. It wasn't nostalgia. It was something deeper. A tribute. A soft acknowledgement of the journey behind us and the road still ahead. Afterward, we lit candles inside the pumpkins and stood back to admire them. The city glowed behind us. Our shadows stretched long against the balcony wall. She reached for my hand and said, "This feels like home." And I realized I hadn't thought of any other place since the day she came back. That night, in bed, with the windows open and the air turning cool, she whispered, "Do you ever wish we'd gotten it right the first time?" I thought for a moment before answering. No. I think the second time is better, because this time we knew what we were risking, and we still chose each other. She kissed me then, not urgently, not as a punctuation, but as a continuation, and I knew, with a kind of quiet certainty I'd never had before, that we were done waiting. Not for the perfect moment, not for the right words, just done waiting to live the life that had been here all along, patient, quiet, real, built not from grand declarations, but from the simple, extraordinary act of staying. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.